Welcome again this evening to the Agile Coaching Exchange for October. I say this evening, but I'm also recognizing we've got people from all sorts of places today. We've got people as far as San Francisco, Cape Town. We've even got people from Norwich. So I just wanted to welcome everyone. It's really great to see such a broad mix of people tonight. And of course, our speaker is coming here from Louisville, Colorado. Is that right, Pete?
Yeah, just outside Boulder, Colorado. Yep.
Boulder, Colorado. So tonight we're introducing Pete Behrens. Pete Behrens is a agile leadership coach of around 30 years, has all sorts of experiences in all sorts of different organizations, big and small. We're really pleased to link up with him from the US, and that's one of the great benefits we've had from the situation. It's been really good to get people from further afield. I met Pete 2 years ago when he was running a really successful Certified Agile Leadership course as part of the Scrum Alliance offer. And it was really, really great to sit with him and see his approach to the kind of things and challenges leaders are having and how we can help them as Agile coaches. So that was really good. And I'm really pleased to be able to pull him in and invite him here to the Agile Coaching Exchange today. So without further ado, I just want to give a very warm Agile Coaching Exchange welcome to Pete Behrens. Over to Pete.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thanks, Benjamin and your team. I was speaking with Benjamin and seeing that the ACE globally, there's a lot here in the US, has been driven by a lot of what you guys have done in this community. So I appreciate your leadership in propelling coaching mindsets and leadership. And I don't see much difference between leadership and coaching to a certain degree. And so I think there's a high degree of overlap there. What I'd like to do is share just a little bit about how kind of we see the world in a sense. And yeah, I've been in this space for 30 years, much as a practitioner. So as a leader, whether it's an engineer, a development manager, et cetera, to teaching, coaching Scrum. I've been a CST for many years. And so bringing some of that experience in with this. And some people ask me, how did you go from engineer to leadership coach? And it seems like a big jump in doing that. And one of the things that I found actually is I feel like I'm still doing engineering today. And to tell you how that works, if you think about what an engineer does, an engineer takes a system and optimizes it. And it could be a computer system, a database system, a parking lot, an elevator bank, whatever that might be. And your goal is to optimize that system. And I look at what I do today as optimizing people systems. And I help leaders with how to best get the most value out of that people system. And what I find interesting is, unlike technical systems, I think people systems are much more complex. They're much more interesting problems to solve. And they're much more difficult. And so I've been at this both through myself as a leader, as I mentioned, in many organizations, and then as a trainer and a coach. And what I found is some patterns over time about why Agile is working, why it's not. And a lot of what we're going to be sharing today is coming from that experience. It's coming from my both personal experience and experiencing through other leaders this challenge. And so my goal is to share some of that with you. I'm presenting here under this concept of Agile Leadership Journey. I'll share a little bit more about what that is towards the end. Essentially what we're doing is building a community of scaling mindsets over practices. So it ties into what we're doing here. But let me just set the stage with kind of what we're going to be doing here. And so I do encourage engagement, and I know it's virtual, and I know we're kind of all maybe doing a few different things, but feel free to chat. And also we do have a couple of mid-session breakout chats. And so I've asked Benjamin to prep that and get you talking as I'm kind of presenting pieces. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the challenge, which I believe all of you as coaches across the globe are quite familiar with. So I'll zip through that pretty quickly. And then we'll start to illustrate an alternative before I kind of share some of the things that we're doing with our community. And so we'll put in some break points in there for you. But if for whatever reason something happens, or you want to interrupt, or raise your hand, feel free to do so. I'm happy to be responsive in that way as well. So now, this first section just kind of set the stage, the disconnect, what I call the disconnect between scaling and results. we've seen over and over again, and this is the 14th, ClabNet study that says, hey, how's Agile going in the world? And I think you guys are quite aware that the benefits of Agile are quite real, or it wouldn't be expanding. And so this has become quite apparent to most leaders across the globe. This is why there's still a gold rush towards Agile. You're still seeing this across the globe, the need, the desire, the urgency to become more Agile, and that's pretty clear. But at the same time, the barriers have been clear, and these have pretty much been unchanging for about the 14 years I've seen these surveys come through. The one tweak I think this year that is pretty interesting, culture for the first time is not the #1 barrier, which I thought was an interesting change. For 13 years, culture has been at the top of this list. But if you think about it, these top 3, in a sense, or leadership change and culture, are all related to culture. And we'll get into why that is and what that means. And so in a sense, the significant barriers to Agile haven't really changed over the years either. And so this dichotomy is causing a bit of a challenge that I want to set up here. Now, what has become new, which I would say relatively new in terms of Agile, is this concept of the scaling frameworks being what I see as kind of this simple go-to solution for leaders. It's the answer. It's, Scrum used to be, hey, do Scrum and you'll be successful. Now I think it's, well, do SAFe or do Scrum at scale or do less and you'll be successful, whatever that might be. And so the scaling frameworks have become this go-to. But let's just talk a little bit about the challenges that we're seeing. And just to give you a couple of data points. Scrum, who, I've been a part of for, the better part of my career, I've kind of hitched my hook to the Scrum wagon, and I believe full-heartedly in Scrum. But if you think about what Scrum is promising, this concept of 4x productivity, is hard to separate from, and are we seeing, in a sense, that 4x productivity? But they're not alone. If we start to then move into something like SAFe, on their website they'll claim all sorts of pretty wild results in terms of increased productivity, increased employee engagement, faster time to market. I don't necessarily doubt these numbers. I don't doubt that we've seen these numbers at some point in time in some organizations across the globe. My challenge is, I believe what's happening here is we're seeing the top half or the top quadrant of a bell curve. We're seeing the right hand of the bell curve here. Now, the reality, has been demonstrated through some studies that have come out, suggests that about a 12% gain is a better norm, as a better number to be taken when you're talking about transitioning to Agile. And when you start to scale that, what you start to see is actually scaled Agile is closer to about a 5% gain. So what is happening here, and this is, by the way, this particular study was done in 2017. You can go ahead and look at that InfoQ article that was done as a study across a number of organizations. Now, let's just talk briefly about why this might be happening, because what I'm seeing in organizations is that Agile as a goal, as we introduce Agile, that agility is fairly easy to get at the beginning. The problem is, as soon as Agile starts to come into the system, it starts to hit a ceiling. And the ceiling is, in a sense, the current system. And I think as coaches, you've all seen this. And I'm speaking to the choir, so to speak, that, we bring in Agile, we bring in Scrum, we start to expose the impediments, the structures and the teams and the roles and the departments and the, approval processes, the systems, things like that, all the different things that are in place in the organization that aren't really aligned to Agile. And so what tends to happen is, what's easier to change, Agile or the system? Well, the system tends to win. And so that means Agile tends to lose. And so what we tend to do is we tend to get these Agile definitions applied to existing systems. So this is where you might get, 3 design sprints and analysis sprints, things like that, where the current system stays in place, but we've Agilified it to some degree. Now, the way this is happening, what I've seen over time, and this was influenced through some pattern work that James Copleen and Neil Harrison did way back in about 2004. They talked about this onion layer to an organization and saying, okay, when we come in with Agile, we come in typically on the outer of the onion, the process. How do people work? And maybe we start to touch on some systems. So change a role, we change the team structure, we change a department, we rearrange a few furniture, we rearrange a little bit of maybe some of our structural systems. But ultimately what starts to happen is we start to hit culture, we start to hit the values of the organization. And the way that I see this is a little bit like, think of the system as being the vault that's protecting the values. So just as a true bank vault would protect money, the system has been put in place to protect a value system of the way a company works. And so what happens essentially is that system is designed to be a safety system. And whether this comes top down, leaders say, hey, let's go do Agile as a whole system, or bottom up, I see the same issue happening. And so this culture starts to become kind of the key. And this is why this has been raised to the top of most of these surveys is, give you kind of one example. If you say, all right, if our, predictability is, one of the values that we hold true, we must be predictable, must be reliable. Well, what ends up happening? Well, we've built a bunch of systems. That could be systems like, requirements and plans and budgets to drive that predictability value. So all that system protects a particular value, like predictability, like quality, like, our money in a sense of these projects. And so there's a disconnect here, a clash. Now, just to give you one more data point before we pause and do a little bit of a breakout. The Business Agility Institute did a couple of studies in 2018 and 19, 440 organizations across the globe, and a couple of patterns they recognized. Number one, Agile is penetrating every part of the globe, just as we're seeing here in this group. That's awesome. But number two, the results aren't so good. And across these studies, what they said was essentially the business agility, the actual results of Agile, are at what they call kind of a toddler phase of walking. Like, okay, we're just getting our feet under us. We're just actually starting to, maybe even execute Agile in some effective way from a business agility perspective. And another measure that was used here was called fluency. That means the fluidity of the organization to change. And about 80% of the organizations had what they consider to be low fluency. And so what this is indicating is while we're getting adoption, we're not getting maturity, we're not getting effectiveness. And so essentially what's happening is we have a disconnect between the promise of Agile, of, hey, it's going to do all these great things, and the reality of a scaled results that, hey, is this actually impacting the way we're doing our work? So what I'd like to do is just pause here. This is the problem. This is something I think we've all seen. And so what I'd like to prompt you with a question in a breakout room is just, what disconnects are you seeing between the promise of a scaled Agile and the efforts that we put into that scaled Agile and the ensuing business results? And is that impacting the business in a promising way? Is that, having, and I'm open to having positive and negative responses. I'm not trying to provoke that everybody's having problems. I'm provoking that for the most part, we have a disconnect in the industry between what's being promised and what's actually surfacing. So Benjamin, I'll let you take over and control the breakouts.
Fantastic. So in a moment, you should all get an invite inviting you into one of the breakout rooms. Please select that and come in. As we are recording tonight, we are going to give the option of recording a conversation around this question in the main room. So if you don't mind being recorded, maybe if a small group of you would like to stick in this room and discuss the theme here openly, then that's fine. Otherwise, please go to the breakout room that you'll get prompted for. Okay.
So any thoughts on that question? What disconnects are you seeing between the promise and the efforts versus the results?
Yeah, this is Jay. I'm seeing all the same disconnects working with several organizations and some of the current ones we're working with. Unfortunately, what I'm also seeing is there's no easy solution. Okay, so as you know, and I think many people agree with this, that culture comes from organization design and organization change, right? Role changes and having one team. There's no engineer, there's no business in IT anymore. Okay, it's one team producing a product, solving a market need, and so forth, et cetera, and they have to work together. I think, and I hate to say this, but I think, how we've developed Scrum over the years, and we created product owners in a product domain, which is kind of a real profession now, and an engineering IT domain, and what Scrum does, as well as SAFe and LESS, all them, kind of missed the boat on the organization design, organizational structures, the change management, all that sort of stuff that you got to do, which then over time we're learning now that, hey, you still have to do all that stuff, right? And you have to work with executives as well as the teams. For example, how do I transition project management discipline or the project managers and portfolio managers into new agile roles? And how does that change the organizational structure, right? So all these things I think we're still working with and dealing. I have not seen, and maybe someone can help me, I have not seen a one-size-fit-all solution. That's all I have.
And that's what leaders are asking for, is give me the answer.
Yeah, and this is the problem with best practices. I think, the phrase best practice should be taken out and shot. There's kind of, practices that are contextually useful and applicable. But if you take the Spotify model and apply it to a bank, clearly it's not going to be a good ending. So I definitely agree. There's not one size fits all. I think a lot of the approaches to trying to change organizations are quite similar, though. So if you look at people's culture and behaviors, a lot of that is influenced by the system, by their weird procurement rules, the way they do budgeting and all the rest. So if we can start to try and do some experiments to try and change those, I think those are quite, powerful. If you can actually change the system and policies, you start to change the behaviors and the culture. Where if you go in and you put up placards going, we will be a can-do culture, we'll be this kind of culture, we'll have empathy, it has absolutely no effect whatsoever. I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Dale.
I mean, I haven't experienced it in a huge number of companies, but I think, I think so that some of the stuff we've been looking at, the team topology stuff and things like that, is relevant because some of those structures are built out for things like the organizational structure is built for the ease of managing, the hierarchy of management, but it's not built to make doing the job better. And you're battling that, and you butt up against that the whole time, and you find that you cannot get communication flowing cleanly around the business, focused on the value you're trying to do, because you've got this imposed hierarchical system put in place that's purely about keeping the HR system simple. Things like that are very, very hard to change because they affect how you report to people, how you pay people, all that stuff is, very fundamental to a business, but actually can interfere with change.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
I think building on that, what I've observed is that you either end up with, when you're scaling, is you end up with a focus on the teams where they're then bumping up against portfolio management that's not agile, or the focus is on the portfolio management and the teams are not agile teams. They're working in iterations maybe, but they're not actually formed as agile teams. So I feel like there's always a trade-off where we're not getting the whole system agile.
Yeah, I think kind of to add to that is you've got, you could put people at the top who've maybe gone to a conference and heard about Agile and think this is the time that we need to implement this. You could also have it from the bottom, saying, this is a really good way of working. I want more empowerment because, this is, I'm building these products, I want to have a bit more of a say. And then you have the term the frozen middle, which is they're getting attacked from both sides, so to speak, where they're kind of like, I don't have any idea what this is. I'm being told to implement it. And then suddenly, everything freezes. I think that's also a kind of a key point around kind of that adoption, is that not everyone's kind of initially bought in or understands what it is, but they're expected to deliver. So if your manager is telling you to deliver, you're going to deliver and you're going to try your best.
Just picking up on what Colin was saying, I think there is good practice. I think best practice, yeah, we should take that out and shoot it. I quite agree with Colin on that one. And what I've seen is like what can be quite difficult is changes in leadership. So the effect of changes in leadership is when you're halfway through a transformation and you're undergoing that process, then suddenly confidence is lost for whatever reason, and someone gets sucked out and someone else comes in, and then you can get that turbulence and everything kind of goes out of kilter. And also very fast moving sort of parts of the system. So you get good practice with small self-organizing teams in one area, but then then this kind of like other processes come into play to try and sort of shut them down. And I've seen that in many places as well, and that's really, really difficult.
Yeah, good comments here, and I think we're getting some of the other rooms to come back in. And what I'm getting a sense, and I recognize this, we're speaking to the choir here. You guys all recognize this challenge. You've seen this challenge, and I think the bigger question is, what do we do about it? What are some options we have? And I agree, there aren't very many good options. Benjamin, looks like you just recreated the rooms again.
No, everyone's coming back in now.
Okay. I got an invite to go to a room, so I don't know if others got that.
I don't know why that popped up.
Kick the presenter out. Yeah.
It was a delay going over the ocean.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing. In a sense, as I was mentioning, I think we all share some commonality here in the problem. And what I'd like to do is maybe spend a little bit more time about a potential solution. And that solution isn't necessarily a practice. It's more about a shift in mindset. And so what we're talking about here is provide clients with an enhanced ability to lead their own journey. And this is kind of born from the fact that I've been in a lot of organizations and I brought Agile in only to kind of have it fall apart over time. And initially I took pride in that. Initially I would like, hey, Pete's awesome. You need Pete to solve this problem. It's that heroic leader mindset of, you need me, so hire me. And this is what a lot of consulting practices are built on. You need us, we come in, we help, we prop it up, and then we leave, but we take a lot of that learning with us. What the premise here is to train and coach leaders to create an engaged workforce imbued with true agency. And that's kind of an interesting language. Basically, this is their ownership. This is their approach, and provide them with the basic training and coaching for a growth mindset. So what I want to do is just share a little bit of what this means, what we're trying to do at the Agile Leadership Journey. We look at this as really an alternative, or at least an enhancement to taking any scaling approach, that if you can apply this with it, you're going to be much more effective at what you're trying to accomplish in terms of, hitting some of those business goals. So what this looks like is, rather than coming from the outside in, we're approaching this from the inside out. And I'm not setting this up as either or. I'm not suggesting we don't go outside in. What I'm suggesting is, if you do that alone, it's not going to work. That if you couple it with an inside out, you couple it with a culture first. Now, as I think Colin mentioned in our breakout, this is not putting posters on the wall and saying, hey, empowerment, and all those types of things. This is leaders understanding what is our culture, what are the values that we hold true to, and what systems are holding those values in place. What is our system? So it's creating awareness to the system and this culture and what culture is, and then using that to, in a sense, design an architectural system, an organizational system that will promote and support and grow Agile ways of working. So what I want to illustrate here, though, this is not necessarily a major reorganization. You can do this quite simply, and I'll share some examples of that. Also, we want to say that you must come in with some leadership education. We have to retrain leaders, because what I see in most organizations is, and this is the problem coming top down, leaders use this as, oh, go do that Agile thing. That's what top down means to them. Go manage that. We put an Agile team in place. Leaders, they don't play a role. And that becomes the fail point. Leaders don't take ownership of what's going on. And the third thing I want to say is, this is personal. What I mean by that is, leaders have to take ownership, not just for the system, but for themselves. And I want to share a little bit about what this means with regard to leaders taking kind of some of this ownership. So what this looks like is, rather than getting this curve that kind of comes up, hits the ceiling and goes down, our goal here is to raise the ceiling, basically lift the ceiling. What is the ceiling? And if the system is the ceiling, leadership's responsible for that system. And so it's their job to kind of, what is limiting our agility and how do we improve that? So yes, this will start to play in some of the things I think we're all familiar with, roles, departments, budgets, processes, things like that. But it's not only those things. Sometimes it's just, how do we measure success? How do we, approve decisions and spending and things like that. And then our goal is to kind of, inspect and evolve over time. Now, just a pause here. In our world, Agile's not the goal. And I think as coaches, you probably would speak this same truth. This often is missed by most leaders. They get stuck, or organizations get stuck. Agile becomes the goal. And anytime Agile's brought to me as a, hey, Pete, we want to be more Agile, or hey, Pete, we want to do safe, or hey, Pete, we want to, whatever it might be, my first question is why? What's the business driver behind this? Because to me, the way we're thinking, Agile is a means to improve some business result. And people and culture become the key factors to getting at that. So our philosophy here is, if you don't start with leaders, it's not going to work, or it will only work for a very short period of time. So let's just dive into this just briefly and into just understanding a little bit of this concept of culture. If you're familiar at all with some of the culture philosophy, Edgar Schein, who's got probably the Bible on culture, 400+ page books on what culture is. If I were to summarize that in a very simple way, it's basically thinking about that as a coin. Heads on one side, tails on the other, leadership and culture. Think of this as basically symbiotic. Leadership shapes culture, culture shapes leadership. So if you think about a new company, a startup, that ends up taking that mindset of that leader. If the leader is aggressive, the company becomes aggressive. The leader's conservative, the company becomes conservative. But over time, excuse me, as the cultures develop, the culture takes over. And then as new leaders come in, they need to mold into that culture. Well, getting back to this, if we want to reshape culture, leadership has to be the one to do that. We've got to be able to demonstrate or address some of these systemic types issues. But the danger is thinking this has to happen from the top. And I would even recommend, I'd say, don't wait for that CEO, because what we see is, while we do have a few people on that kind of high end of, CEOs making significant investment in the way a company's, thinking about this, in most organizations, or I guess in all organizations, risk rises as you go up the chain. So there's a lot more risk for the CEO to do Agile than there is for somebody in the middle. So we tend to see Agile initiatives happen somewhere in the middle. And in fact, that's okay, because the way we look at this is, you can shape culture from wherever you are in the organization. And let me just describe that a little bit about how everybody shapes culture. So one way to visualize culture is to think about culture as being like a shadow. So when we think about, it's a reflection of the organization itself. It's hard to get a grasp of, it's hard to get hold of, but it's a representation of what's there. And so if you think about a shadow, how do you change a shadow? Well, there's two ways. One is change the light source, which is really difficult. One is just to change ourselves, which, is hard, but not that hard, something we can do. And when we think about it, senior leaders, top level leaders, have a fairly broad shadow. And so when you take a look at something like this, so take a look at Microsoft as an example. Now, whether you like Microsoft, whether you know Microsoft, good or bad, think about the transition that was happening over the past 20 years at Microsoft, from Bill Gates, who grew that company up and, represented, a fairly interesting culture, part of which is highly competitive culture, fast moving, but a good learning company. Moving that, there was this big kind of transitionary handoff, like it was almost like a king to a prince kind of handoff to Steve Ballmer, who had been there forever, handing over the reins of Microsoft to Steve Ballmer. And to all intents and purposes, Steve Ballmer did some good things at Microsoft. He introduced some of the cloud technology that Microsoft's been pretty good at. But he missed a tremendous amount of things in terms of Microsoft missed a tremendous amount of things in terms of mobile and some of the cloud technologies like AWS, et cetera. They fell behind on a lot of things. But more importantly, when you look at what was happening at Microsoft, is internally it was rotting. Internally, there was some cultural elements inside Microsoft that were just starting to fail. And when you look at performance of someone like Microsoft versus Apple, it's night and day. Where Apple's growing, 1,400% because of iPads and iPhones between 2005 and 19 or whatever that is. Microsoft struggling through that same time period. You take a shift of someone like Satya Nadella, and I encourage you, if you haven't read or heard too much of Satya Nadella as a significant leader in the world making a big impact. He's got a book called Hit Refresh here, not the best book in the world, but really interesting book. And the fact of what is culture in terms of Satya Nadella. And Satya Nadella has not only changed the internal culture of the organization to be more holistic and effective and more creative, he's changed it, a lot of it through their strategy. And so, for example, as Microsoft is competing for decades, and early days, Microsoft won. They beat Netscape, they beat Apple and all those in the early days. But under Steve Ballmer, they were losing. That competitive nature just wasn't getting it done for them. Satya Nadella came in and said, wait a second, what if we collaborate with our competitors? What if we work together with, Apple? Why can't our products, our Word products or Office products be on Apple products? What's wrong with that? And so in a sense, he came in with a much more holistic perspective in the market and the strategy, but also in the way we work and the creativity. And he's being praised and rewarded today as probably one of the most significant cultural change leaders in the globe. Now, recognize that's a huge impact, and those are unicorns kind of in the world today. And so the question is, what does that have to do with us? Because my guess is nobody here is at the level of a Steve Ballmer or Satya Nadella. You're probably not running a multi-billion-dollar organization, and if you are, show your hand. I'd like to see you, and that's great you're here. But most of us are local leaders, and what we say is the local leaders shape culture more acutely, more intensely. And if you ask people why do they leave a company, it's not because of the CEO often, sometimes, but it's more likely because of my manager, because of the person that's managing me. It's that direct leader that's causing that influence. And this is where we say that as leaders across the organization, we focus more on leadership, the ship side of leaders. That concept of leadership happens in everyone. You could be an engineer and represent leadership. You could be a designer and represent leadership. Leadership is not necessarily in role and in position. It's in influence. It's in mindset. And so every leader does shape. And give you one example, somebody that came through our practice program. So they come and they learn a little bit about some of the tools. They practice some of these tools. Travis is a mid-level leader at a credit union in Washington State, in the United States. He got this letter from one of his senior leaders. It said, Stephen Covey once said, I'm personally convinced that one person can be a change catalyst, a transformer in any situation, any organization. So yeah, what I'm reading here is a card that was given to Travis by one of his leaders, and basically saying, such an individual here is yeast that can leaven an entire loaf. I love that quote. But you have been a change catalyst for our organization. You had the vision for Agile Team Works. You influenced the CEO and the executive team. You executed the vision and transformed the way we work. As a result, our company is more resilient to change and able to adapt to an increasingly dynamic world. So what we're indicating here is in a sense, and just to kind of go back to this other picture, yes, while senior leaders do cast a broad shadow, they do cast kind of this overarching kind of culture in an organization. It's the local leaders that we think actually start to really make this significant impact in organizations. And you can start to shape what we call microcultures and culture bubbles inside organizations. And those can start to then fan out. When we talk about scaling Agile, it isn't necessarily because we've impacted the broad shadow. It's because we've started to address a bunch of smaller shadows in the organization. So the kind of the premise here, the summary of this section before we go back into our breakout, is the simple approach, going to a framework, is nice and easy and it's packaged, but it hasn't necessarily addressed what I would consider the human complexity, right? The dealing with the values, dealing with the humanness of an organization. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, okay, if we can actually start to scale a mindset, start to scale a way of thinking, that will then start to lead towards some other effectiveness and all the other things we're trying to do, whether that be SAFe, Scrum, Kanban, anything like that. And so what I'd like to do is maybe just do another brief breakout here. Where are we at? Top of the hour. Another 7 minutes here where you ask, what would you like to see from senior, and I'll put senior in quotes, this could be your executives, but it could also just be the leaders on top of your division or your department. What would you like to see those senior leaders doing more or less of to help shape the culture in your organization? So that's our prompt. I think you'll get that in the breakout. We will go into a breakout. And again, I think, Benjamin, you'll leave if people want to stay back in the main room. We can
Yeah, absolutely. So in a moment, I will press the button and you'll get a prompt to come into a room. And that'll be in the breakout group to discuss this this question. But if you would like to stay in the main room and be part of the recorded version of this, please feel free. So I'm pressing the button now, and we'll be getting you back here in 7 minutes. So you should all get the alert now.
Hi, Pete. I'm wondering, whilst we're waiting for that, if I could just throw a couple of questions your way.
Sure.
Somewhat indirectly attached to the question you asked, I think there's an even more fundamental thing that needs to be talked about, possibly not in the session, and that's value, right? I only go to a shop and buy something when I can see value for myself. And I think one of the things that I struggle with, the biggest thing I struggle with, whether it's in teams, mid-level or senior level executives, is trying to get them to buy in to, well, why would I want to change my process, the things I've done for 30 years? What's the value to me? And really that's I like your analogy with a coin, right? Because it's a double-headed coin. It's what's the value to me? And can we de-risk failure, right? Can we encourage people to try stuff and to not be scared that something's going to happen to them if they fail?
Yeah, what we try to do is we try to actually set up just almost the opposite, where we're saying the things you're doing today are likely the highest risk things. So for example, creating a plan when you know the least, that's incredibly high risk. So wouldn't it be better to make decisions later when you have more information? I mean, just simple agile terms like that, but putting it in terms of risk. And what you've been doing for the last 20, 40, 60 years in organizations is built on a different system. It's built on a different time period. It's built on a different, technology base. And so can you assume that would you live without mobile technology? No. Okay, you've changed that. Why aren't you changing the way you're making decisions? So I think there's a lot of good ways to go about that, but I agree with you, Mike, that there has to be a value for them.
Yeah, and I think empowerment is the other thing I was going to say, which is, if you want to encourage leaders at any level, you really need to empower people to be able to speak up and try things and experiment and do all of that good stuff. So if you can do that, then I think you get to a critical mass where people are finding that people that are trying new things are being celebrated. And then there's a cultural shift, right? You start getting people being celebrated, and hopefully you get a snowballing effect from there.
And recognize failure is one of those value terms that, we don't fail around here. So how do you experiment when you can't fail, and things like that. So those things have to be talked about. Yeah. Other thoughts here about what you'd like to see senior leaders doing more or less of?
I'd like them to dictate less and ask questions more, help engage people. They basically employ lots of bright people and then they tell them what to do. So try and reverse that. And I think that's one of those behavior changes where you're leading by example. And I think that also goes into the leading by example about failure or mistakes or things that have gone wrong, and just turning them over and saying, okay, what can we learn from them?
Yeah, thanks, Colin.
I think for me, sorry.
Go ahead, Gilda.
Thank you. I think for me, it's just exactly kind of like what you were saying before as well, just in terms of creating that environment, that safe space that allows people to experiment, because I think certainly in my organization, you know, you get sort of like the idea of like, yeah, we welcome, you know, this new approach and we're going to be agile and everything. But at the end of the conversation, leadership still want a Gantt chart that will guarantee that by, you know, in the next 2 months, we're going to get to the value that we all committed to, and, you know, all this great stuff. Which understandably, yes, you know, we need to achieve some outcomes and everything. But I think there's too much heavy focus on like, you know, it's a bit of a disconnect. It's probably a bit of that gap. And like, yeah, I'm talking about let's do things differently, but I want commitment to have all this done in 2 months, you know. So it's like, okay, there's a bit of a disconnect. So it would be great to see them doing more of actually saying, yes, we create this environment to allow you to actually deliver in a different way, and, you know, not necessarily commit to like 12-month plans, but let's review it in a more iterative way.
Joshua.
Or comment. Yeah, and one thing that's very important, I think, what we experience is that it's very important that you as a leader know to create, to know what empowerment is, because it's not letting go of everything. It's also setting the playing field.
Yep.
This is the playing field, and we are heading that direction. And then letting it unfold within that playing field, because it's often like, yeah, but then I can do as a squad, I can do what I want. No, you can't. You are delivering some value to somewhere, some stakeholder who needs that value. And of course, we have a playing field, we have a context in which we do this. And that's very important to understand, because we have had many of those misunderstandings in our company, where we are going this way and this way and that way, but it was around that way we should go.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also very important, that it's not letting go, it's also empowering in the right direction, if you say.
Yeah, the way we talk about that is oftentimes, you know, you want to you know, delegate or separate, but in a sense, letting go too much is kind of swinging the pendulum too far. So how do you stay engaged without being a jerk, or without taking over, or without being over influenced? That's a hard balance. You know, that's a really tricky place to be for a lot of leaders. Joshua, you're going to say something?
I think it builds on that point, and I think Mike mentioned it at the start, which is it's just providing that kind of clear vision. Like the way I kind of see it is, it's finding those kind of goals that the teams need to be able, or teams or departments need to be able to deliver, because you'll find it's always product focused, or it's, oh, we need to deliver this for these reasons, and okay, what are those reasons? Well, I can't really tell you, or it's, oh, I don't really know. And I think if there was more of that kind of senior leadership saying, okay, the reason why we're going to deliver this is because of, you know, it benefits this market, it benefits us, it benefits this party, or whatever kind of third party there is, or anything. I think if there was a more kind of, I guess it's more kind of transparency that helps build that vision, that then helps you go and reach the moon, so to speak.
Yeah.
I would say that's correct, because then one of the other things is having those communication channels. Because one of the major issues that we feel is, oh, we were not even aware of that we are going to do something else. So why it was not communicated to me at earlier stage? So having that open communication channels and that feedback loops, wherein people will be able to get their feedback. So having those experiments and how did they go, and then communicating that across the teams, or even all the way down, will definitely be something that will help build that culture, that yes, we are open, we are trying something, and then there is this something that didn't work, something that worked, and then now we are going on this chosen path.
Yep. Yep.
Hello?
Any other thoughts?
I've just been messaged by Terence, who's in the room, and he's not sure he can be heard. Can you speak up, Terence?
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh,
just barely.
Bit quiet, but we'll count down.
What's going on here? Can you make out what I'm saying?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, Pete, I have a very serious concern to me, just from personal, professional, U.S. and international experiences, is that one thing that's hardly ever mentioned is CQ, cultural intelligence, and the importance of working with different cultures, or, you know, the importance put on learning about different cultures, you know, in our work. You know, we can learn so much from ourselves, and we know we can grow so much just from that alone. So I'd like for you to speak a little bit on that importance, if you will.
Yeah, in fact, that's what this last little segment will be about, is in a sense, what is culture? How do we teach it? Because you're right. I think, to me, the biggest miss of leadership is the awareness of their influence. And whether or not they're part of the Agile transformation, they are influencing the transformation. They are influencing scaling. And I think a lot of leaders assume they don't have to be a part of that system. And in fact, then they become inhibitors, or they become blockers themselves. And, you know, they're not helping that system. And so what we try to do, our fundamental goal is to create awareness in leaders, and just to help them understand, there's an impact you're having here. And whether or not you know it or not, you're having that impact. And so that's our first and foremost goal. But let me go ahead and share. I'll get my screen share on this one now. And just to kind of touch on just a couple of things, the approach we take at the Agile Leadership Journey about what we're trying to do here, in a sense. We use something called the compass as our guide to do this. And the way the compass is laid out, we say, if our goal is increased value delivery, that's kind of the bottom left there. What we have to recognize is the organization is shaped by the leaders. This is the shadowing effect, that if you want an Agile organization, you need Agile leaders. And so what we try to do is we try to teach that leadership to improve the organization to deliver an increased value stream. And so just to kind of show you a visual of that, our focus is teaching leadership. And through that leadership, we teach a mindset that says, okay, how I think shapes a culture. How I act shapes my culture. And through that thinking and acting, we start to shape the organizational culture, which starts to impact that delivery stream, which then we can start to think about this flywheel starting to spin and saying, okay, we're delivering value, we're creating better leaders in our organizations. Now, to kind of touch on this a little bit, we look at two ways to shape culture. And I don't say change cultures. Culture's a really difficult thing to change, but we can shape it. And what I mean the difference there is we can influence it. We can tweak it. And the way we address that is every leader can shape it in what we call the microculture. That means how I make a decision. How do I run a meeting? How do I hold a discussion? You know, all of these things are changing culture locally, changing culture in small spheres. And you get enough leaders doing this, you start to create enough bubbles, you start to shape culture. And then the broader one, which a lot of the scaled programs try to approach, is the macro culture. But what we don't teach is, we don't teach SAFe or Scrum at Scale or less. What we teach is, what are the principles behind that? What are the structural elements? What are the policy elements? What are the metrics? These are the levers that we focus on that help shape culture. And all of the scaling frameworks are built on these levers. You know, when you look at how Lego adopted SAFe, they took 20% of it. And Henrik Nyberg did a great, approach of applying SAFe in a very simplistic way with Lego, and quite effective. But that wasn't SAFe. That was Henrik applying some of these principles of, taking, this concept of what's the Lego culture, how do we best use these levers to then start to shape, for leaders to kind of own the system. So just a brief highlight, one of the things we do is we start to teach a leadership mindset. Now this is driven from leadership agility. And just to give you an example of this, when we look at leadership growth, we don't just look at shifting from a directive style leadership to an indirective or a delegatory or an empowerment style leadership. What we look to is an adaptive leadership, a situational leadership, a more aware leadership. And what we try to help leaders recognize is, as you grow in your leadership maturity, you start to become more creative and more adaptive. And so our goal isn't just servant leaders. It's not just soft or weak leaders. It's adaptive leaders who are more aware and more responsive to what they're doing. And so this construct of what we call expert achiever catalyst leadership, this starts to open up a whole new framework for most leaders. And to be honest, yes, most leaders, it's probably better to take a step back and be less directive. But for a good portion of leaders, to be a more effective leader, we find it actually means you need to step forward. You need to step in. You need to be more assertive to be a more effective catalyst leader. And so we start to go into this construct that even with leadership, not all changes are in the same direction. Everybody is different in the way they have their bias, and everybody is different in the way they need to improve their effectiveness. And so what we love about this model is it starts to teach maturity and awareness, not just a skill. Now, the second thing we focus on, and getting towards, I forget who it was there asking the question about culture. We focus on something called the competing values framework, which is, again, a generic framework of value system. It talks about different value systems. And again, our focus isn't there is one Agile value system. Yes, there are Agile values like in the manifesto. But if you think about it, those value systems talk about things like innovation and also collaboration and quality and speed of delivery. They impact every value system. So Agile, yes, while it's a set of values, has various dichotomies. And what we find is some organizations grab onto some parts of Agile, but not others. And it creates a very dysfunctional form of Agile. What we try to do is we try to help bring that apart and say, okay, what are the values in your organization? What are the values that you're strong in and weak in? And agility is about shaping your culture to be more effective. And the research behind this tool is, this concept of creating balance in your culture, the concept of your weakest quadrant is going to be your limiting factor. So how do you strengthen that weakness? How do you improve a dimension that maybe you're weak in? And maybe that's teamwork, maybe that's creativity, maybe that's quality. We don't know. And again, this is where it's not one size fits all, but we provide the tools for leaders to self-diagnose, to then improve and guide their path forward. So this is a kind of an eye chart, but I just wanted to kind of share with you, because you guys are a coaching community, we think of this in terms of 3 stages. The far left stage here is what we call the awareness stage, where we're just there to teach, okay, hey, this is what it's about. Create some ahas in leaders to say, I see there's a new way maybe I can behave as a leader. There's a new way we can think about our organization. And then we take those into practice programs. And these are more like 6-month programs where we're actually going into depth 360s and cultural assessments and things like that, where you take a deep dive, and we do these in small cohorts that are working together. And then finally, we're growing our guide community, where we're looking for people like you who are interested and said, okay, I've got a good Agile background, I've got a pretty good leadership background, and I understand I've worked with leaders. I'd love to help. I'd love to help scale this movement in a sense. And so we're continually looking to grow our guide community. And it requires a bit of a vetting process, and we agree to certain things around the curriculum we're sharing. And just to give you a little bit of reason why, essentially, if you think about something like the CAL program and the Scrum Alliance, it's great in the fact that it's wide open. And I helped develop CAL, so I'm quite familiar with it, and it's wide open. The problem with CAL is I can go to Colin's CAL, or Michael Sahoda's CAL, or Pete Behrens' CAL, and I get totally different experiences. And so what we're trying to do is create a shared experience. So you go to any of the Agile Leadership Journey guides, you're going to get a shared experience, a shared set of models. Because when you're taught Scrum or Kanban, I could go to any trainer, and I, for the most part, going to be taught Scrum. It's got a framework. The problem with Agile leadership today is there is no common framework. There is no defined source. And so we've chosen one particular defined kind of set of truths, models that we find to be effective. And all the guides that are joining our community are agreeing to leverage and leverage that and use those common tools with some expansion capacity to that. So just kind of give you a sense of what we're doing in the Agile Leadership Journey. So in a sense, our goal is to inspire and catalyze leaders to improve themselves and their organizations to be more adaptive and effective in these challenging times. And so what we're doing is growing this community. We're growing. We've got about 35 guides globally, but this is an area we are increasingly expanding and looking to grow. So I'd be happy to take questions around both, obviously, the practice we've been discussing in terms of the scaling kind of approaches, as well as anything about the Agile Leadership Journey. I'll put a caveat. I have a class coming up at the bottom of the hour, so I've got about 6 minutes before I have to cut out and teach my class. So apologize for that. And I thought maybe the way we do this is just if you want to use your little thumbs up, if you want to talk, put a little thumbs up. or just raise your hand or something, and we'll just kind of make sure we're not talking over each other. Somebody have a question or something you'd like to share? And then Benjamin might have a few things after I leave, so just be aware that you don't necessarily have to jump away when I go.
Thanks, Pete. So has anyone got a thumbs up they want to? Actually, just while we're waiting for someone to come up with that, well, we have a question here from Femi. When we get, in fact, Femi, would you like to just speak this one up? Because it's
I could do that.
There's a lot of acronyms there.
Pete, thank you very much for that insight. And I recently attended Bob Galen's Cal 1 class. And as he rightly said, when you go to different trainers, the expectation, the experience is absolutely different. And I haven't tried anyone else in the UK, but I've heard from some of my colleagues who've been on their classes. My specific question, as we know, Cal 1 is changing into Cal O, Cal E, Cal T. Is there any plan ahead to change Cal 2?
Yeah, you know, it's the switch. The reason they switched from Cal 1 to branching that out is we recognize there was some that were teaching more senior leaders, some that were teaching more team leaders, and that's where the Cal E and the T kind of, or the O, sorry, the O and the T came out. Yeah, I would imagine Cal 2 is gonna be bifurcated as well. I think the plan would be that we have a leadership, an E focus Cal 2. That's what we focus on today, is taking E, the individual leadership. And my guess is there's probably going to be a similar split where there may be more of that T or O focus Cal 2, but there is no plans yet to change that. It's just a premise that I believe will happen.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the group?
Mike raised his hand, or is just clapping his hand?
Ah, yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I raised my hand. Yeah, so something that you said just sparked a question. You're talking about something that I'm understanding as meaning sort of standardization. So having a uniform approach, or if you go into different classes, you're going to have some type of uniform session. And of course, some of the problems with uniformity can be that you're teaching that there's one way rather than there's many ways. We already know that we've got Kanban, Lean, Scrum, Waterfall, right? If we look at Carnarvon framework, it tells us certainly that there's different approaches that are appropriate for different problems. So in your classes, do you teach this is our way, but there are other ways? Or are you teaching that there is only one way? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a really good point. Let me just highlight one of those things that is a barrier, which is inconsistency. So, you know, one of the things that scaled frameworks do is they do provide consistency, and organizations like that consistency, and that's why they're gravitating to the frameworks. The problem is, we believe, is they're being consistent on the wrong things.
Yeah.
They're being consistent on the how. What we try to do is we try to be consistent on the tools to expose mindset and values, but we try to be flexible in the how. So in some cases, the Kanban or Scrum iterative approach might be more effective. In some cases, yes, the release train works for that team set. We don't teach that how. We teach behind that a little bit, some of the things behind it in terms of the values and what would help our you know, what is our key, you know, optimizing principle, like in less. And so we're teaching a little bit more of the fundamentals, and we're consistent on those models, not on the agile practice models.
Brilliant, thank you.
Pete, I'm conscious of your training class that's about to start, but just before I bid you farewell, I just wanted to ask you if people wanted to follow you in some way, what's the best way of keeping up to date with everything that's going on over there for you?
Yeah, so if you browse over to Agile Leadership Journey, you'll see a little sign up for the newsletter, or just follow me on LinkedIn. We also have an Agile Leadership Journey on LinkedIn. Any of those will kind of get you information that's going on. Of course, Twitter as well, but LinkedIn's probably more of the platform that we use mostly.
Thank you. And there were 2 books you mentioned. Can you just repeat those for the group?
Yep. Book 1 is Bill Joyner's Leadership Agility. That's the mindset that we use in terms of the fundamental principle. And the second book is Competing Values Leadership, which talks about the cultural model and how you can use the leadership to use behind that cultural model. And that comes out of University of Michigan. Again, both of those tools have been around for a few decades, so they're not brand new. They're well researched, well understood from a effectiveness perspective, and they're not Agile tools. They don't come out of the Agile community. They come out of the leadership and organizational communities. So
brilliant.
I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for the organizing community for letting me speak, and I apologize, I got to rush out, but I encourage you to stay in chat and finish up your business here, and feel free to reach out at any point and chat with me.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Pete, thank you very much, and I hope your class goes fantastically well. It's the afternoon over there for you, so you've got many more hours of the day left. So
yep,
all the
thank
best.
you.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
Thank you.